So good afternoon. Welcome to this seminar organized by the Interdisciplinary Cluster on Transnational Democracy in the 21st Century. My name is Vel Kostok. I'm a professor in the SPS department, and I co-convene the cluster with Professor Calypso Nicolaidis from Transnational School of Governance, who is with us online. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker, Dr. Jennifer Oser, Associate Professor in the Department of Politics and Government at Ben-Gurion University in Israel. Jennifer is an expert on political participation, public opinion. She has published dozens of articles in leading political science outlets, such as European Journal of Political Research, Political Communication, Public Opinion Quarterly. And today, she will deliver a presentation on her new ERC project on participation and representation in the digital age. So Jennifer, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thanks, Philip, for the wonderful introduction. It's great to see so many of you here online. I think this is my first time giving a hybrid talk in a proper hybrid room. So I'll say to friends and people I haven't met yet who are here with us on Zoom, we have a really lovely and honorable group of colleagues here, both professors and students, and I'm looking forward to a really lively discussion. I'll start with a caveat and say, this is one of the first times that I'm giving a talk about my ERC project since doing the interview for the ERC. Now, those of you who've done it yourself or have prepared loved ones and friends for that experience know that you prepare this very tight 3-minute memorized talk and then have a very aggressive and brief question and answer. So I'm glad to have this opportunity here with you to deprogram myself from talking in that very brief way. I have about a half hour here to talk at the beginning, where I'm going to give a brief overview of the ERC project. And I'm going to go directly into some preliminary findings that are from a paper that I'll be giving at EPSA in Glasgow toward the end of this week. I'm here talking about the talk plan, and then I'll wrap up with some vision for next steps. But coming back here to the opening image on the slides, these pictures really symbolize the central puzzle that motivates the ERC project. So we have here on the left voting, which we know in terms of trends in the past several decades worldwide, primarily from Philip's research, has been the most comprehensive on this, has been declining somewhat over time and really a global kind of a trend. Over the same several decade period, we've seen that all other kinds of participation beyond the electoral arena has been increasing during the same several decades period. We know quite a lot about the sociodemographic correlates of the people who participate in these different types of ways. And one of the main findings that we know is that people who vote tend to be from more modest socioeconomic backgrounds on average than when you take a look at the sociodemographic backgrounds of those who do all of the non-electoral types of participation, protest, contacting, digital participation, et cetera, tend to be more highly educated, more income, et cetera. Those are established findings for several decades and across context for quite a while now. Something that has not been as well researched is what are the implications for representation of these shifting trends in participation? When people participate, one of the main theories about why people participate is that they want their voice to matter. They want to be represented, whether that voice is expressed through the ballot box or whether it's expressed in these non-electoral means. And so these global trends of how people are participating is shifting to be more strong in the non-electoral realm. There's a concern that's been consistently voiced in the literature, particularly by US researchers, Verba, Schlossman, Brady, et cetera, that this multiple ways that people's voices can be raised may lead to increased gaps in unequal representation, which in a lot of recent research we know is a problem worldwide. So these two pictures of how people are participating and the trends that have been established in the literature are really the motivating trends behind my project, taking a look at what are the implications for representation. We know, however, that it's pretty hard to measure, to take a look at global trends of how people participate and also how they combine those types of participation. So what I have here in this slide is the first slide on the project about the theoretical framework of the project that has three elements. The first is taking a look at repertoires of participation, meaning how an individual person, like a stick figure like you or me, how we combine voting and protest and our individual level repertoires of how we participate, right? We know in the political behavior literature that for the most part, we have people who are scholars who are experts on voting or experts on protest. And there aren't, it's harder to look at. There isn't quite as much literature or expertise in what are the distinctive repertoires, the types of participants that exist and how that's changed over time. The second part of the theoretical framework is taking a look also at subjective representation, not only the objective representational measures of how well are people represented by their legislators and policy outcomes. We also want to get a sense of, do people feel that they are being represented? A main question that has not been explored. And finally, the third element is taking a look at the mobilization of lower status groups. Usually how research on this field ends is we do really intense empirical work, both in participation and in representation. And our conclusion is pretty unequal. And we do that in lots of sophisticated different kinds of ways, but that tends to be sort of the scholarly conclusion. The third aspect of the ERC project combines experimental approaches, both field experiments and online experiments, to take a look at how can we mobilize lower status groups into both political participation and representation. And through this novel framework, it allows me and the project to do a new integration of two separate hypotheses in the literature that until I cite here in the bottom on Oxford handbook chapter of mine from 2022, this is, as far as I know, the first time that a study has brought together the American-based hypothesis that I mentioned earlier, Verba, Schlossman, and Brady, that people who participate more are going to be better represented because they communicate their wishes to those who are better, who are decision makers. And therefore, we should worry about unequal representation. That's what I call here the communication hypothesis, that this kind of participation effectively communicates people's preferences. And the second hypothesis here is the grievance hypothesis that is more drawn from the European tradition and literature. I had a chance to meet with Hans-Peter Crazy earlier this week. He would be part among the scholars who would have expected that actually this increase in non-electoral participation may not be a sign of effective communication. It may not be a tool that people are using in order to express their preferences. Rather, it may be a sign of discontent. It may be a sign of grievance. And this emphasizes why we want to take a look at people's subjective representation as well as objective.
Is Israel American or European?
Israel, it's its own can of worms. We can get into that in the discussion. I'd be happy to. So I'm going to move here to the research design. Briefly overview. The first work package is how do people combine political acts, and those are the preliminary findings that I'm going to briefly present here. A key piece to this is harmonizing all of the available best survey programs out there on all of the different participation indicators available, and using a technique that allows us, an analytical technique called latent class analysis, that allows us to look at participant types in a robust way over time. The second work package is about the participation representation connection. So building on that first body of work, we're able to merge that broad data set with representational outcomes of various kinds and take a look at what are the representational patterns over time. Work package 2 also includes qualitative fieldwork in Israel, that a separate can of worms, Israel and Spain, which is a re-interview of activists from the global Occupy movement of that started around 2010-11. We're re-interviewing the same respondents, people who were interviewed during that time period, to specifically focus on their digital participation and perceptions of its efficacy. And finally, the third work package, as I mentioned, gets into field experiments that focus on different ways to mobilize lower status groups. Happy to discuss later different aspects of the team and the intermediate goals, et cetera. So with that, I'll shift to the preliminary findings. This is, as I noted, a paper I'll be giving this week at EPSA. The title is Participant Types in Socioeconomic, can't see the rest of the screen, but I see Zoom people, cleavages across contexts and over time, a multi-level latent class analysis, with co-authored with my colleagues Roberto Di Mari and Juju Beck, who are also senior researchers on my ERC grant. I start here with the theory that is already intuitive from what I spoke about earlier. So what I have here is a 2x2 that sort of in a very simple way lays out how we often think about ideal types of political participants. So on the horizontal, we have institutional participation, often considered voting. You're on the left if you're inactive in voting, and the right if you're active on voting. And then on the vertical, we have non-institutional types of participation. I took the example here of demonstrating. You're toward the top quadrant if you don't demonstrate, and you're toward the bottom if you do demonstrate. And so there are two really easy quadrants to measure. The top left is people who are inactive in all opportunities to participate. The bottom right are people who are active in everything. Now this is kind of easy to measure when you only have two indicators. Those who study this know we often have many more than that and struggle with how to empirically assess the combination of indicators. The top right are people who only vote, and the bottom left are people who only protest. So there's been sort of a rise of expectations in the field that there are people who belong in this bottom left quadrant, people who are disengaged from the electoral arena, but are out there engaged in non-electoral ways in an active manner. So with this theory of these ideal types for political participants, we ask two main research questions. We ask, how do people combine increasingly common non-electoral political acts with electoral-oriented participation in their individual level repertoires of political participation? So a descriptive question about individuals' repertoires and how they've changed over time. And the second is about inequalities. We ask here, how are patterns of participatory inequality changing over time? Here, taking a look at people's sociodemographic backgrounds. To shift the zoom over a bit. Okay, so answering these two research questions in a robust way really requires a shift in how we usually in this field approach these topics both theoretically and methodologically. Analyzing these participant types, it requires us to shift from focusing on single separate political acts, expert on voting, expert on protest, et cetera, to focusing on how actors combine protest with other types of behaviors. So we do that in this paper using the European Social Survey. In this paper, we've used 2002 to 2018. We're in the process of updating the data and the measures. We use the countries that are in all of the waves during that time period, 14 countries. And we use a battery of all of the political participation indicators, vote plus 7 non-electoral indicators, and a series of standard sociodemographic correlates, age, gender, education, et cetera. Our methods here, as I've noted, this latent class analysis, this technique that allows taking a look at how people combine multiple indicators into a specific type or repertoire of behavior. And in this paper, we implement 3 recent developments in the methodological literature. I noted earlier, I have 2 co-authors on this paper. They're both statistical methodologists, LCA experts. I'm not a statistician, but I enjoy reading their equations and learning from them and implementing them in our applied work together. So the first recent development that we implement in this paper is we use multi-level analysis with covariates, which what that means is we're able to take a look at individuals across countries and also take a look at their sociodemographic backgrounds that are associated with the participant types. I know there's at least one colleague here who's used LCA before and knows that it's very challenging in a very practical way. The software hasn't existed until recently to be able to estimate that kind of a model. And part of how we're able to do that is, I note here references at the bottom, with these colleagues, an additional colleague, unequal. We have a paper in structural equation modeling that lays the statistical framework for being able to add those 2 innovations of multi-level with covariates. And this is a paper in which we implement that. The second method innovation is measurement equivalence across countries. Again, something that we would want to do in this type of model, but there hasn't been the software in place to do it. And then finally, we do something special in this specific paper that we haven't done before, of a semi-supervised specification. So think of those different, and I'll say it specifically, of the inactive group and of the group that only votes, right? So we have a theoretical expectation that there are going to be groups like that, that there are going to be people who do nothing, and there are going to be people who only vote. If you combine those people in with all the other respondents in a latent class analysis model, it'll probabilistically assign them to other classes, and they'll get mixed up with other groups. So since we theoretically know and expect from other work with the data that those 2 groups exist and they're theoretically important for our analysis, we define them a priori, and we're able to maintain them in the analysis while we're also getting a richer identification of the other participant types. So moving here to the findings, we have, yeah.
Can I just ask a clarification question? With the place and cluster analysis, is the idea that you're assigning individuals to a particular class, a particular cluster? And are you also giving those individuals a probability estimate about whether they're in that cluster or not? Right. So it's not that you're assigning that cluster, that's it. You're also giving them so that it's almost like there's a continuous probability that they're in a particular cluster.
Excellent question. I can tell you teach methods. So the entire modeling process is probabilistic. So that's part of why assigning those groups that we know are going to be 0 or 1 is important theoretically. And I think that'll become clear as I go to the findings. Ask a follow-up question, please, if it's not. This table, and I'll say I'm going to go through these findings pretty quickly, just to give a taste of the flavor of the work, and I'm happy to expand upon it in the Q&A, you know, into the evening until my Glasgow shuttle at 3:30 in the morning. What we have here is the table of the means of these 8 participation indicators, starting at the top with the most common. This is voting 0.79, so about 80% of people in these countries self-report in the ESS that they voted, skipping all the way down to the last row here. Party that you've worked for a political party or group is only around 4%. We know that these are in line with established kind of trends in the literature. And then all in the middle, we have these additional types of participation, petition at 28%, boycott at 20%, et cetera. I'll note here that this ordering from top to bottom will be the consistent ordering in which these indicators are presented in subsequent figures.
This is from the European social survey.
Yeah.
Not on the basis.
Yep, exactly. And this is pooled data 2002 to 2018. Yeah. Here, the same set of data are presented over time, where we've made an additive index of the indicators except for vote. So vote at the top, we see up there at the 0.8, it's flat as we would expect from the literature during this time period. We see that non-institutional and institutional, all these other ways of participating, active all, have increased in the recent years. So that then we know that these data are sort of in line with what the other trends have been documented in the literature. What I do in this slide is I give you a preview before a visual. If you haven't seen a latent class analysis finding before, the conditional probability piece of it can be a bit hard to get the bigger picture. So what we have here is my description of the 5 latent classes that get identified in the analysis. So we have a vote specialist group. It's about 40% of the overall population, meaning people who vote and do absolutely nothing else of all the other indicators. We have a non-institutionalized group, meaning people who are particularly strong in petitioning, protesting, et cetera. Because it's probabilistic, it doesn't mean that that group doesn't vote, but we get a conditional probability measure of their degree of voting, which is lower than those who vote only. That's 34% of the group. We have the inactive group, 14% of the population. I want to draw some attention to this because in our usual regression models, the inactive group they drop out of our radar screen to be able to easily pay attention to and measure them. We're usually taking a look at what are the characteristics of those who are active and not as much those who are inactive in all. Institutionalized participants, meaning those who are particularly strong in party and contacting their officials, but are low on the non-institutional measures of party, of demonstrating, petitioning, et cetera. And then finally, we have a fairly small group who are all around activists, 5%, who are relatively high probabilistically on all of these measures. Okay. So now I'm going to give you a visual for each of those. This is the vote only. That's an easy visual. The next easy visual is those who are inactive. And moving here to the non-institutional, when we move from left to right, this is the conditional probabilities of the latent class analysis findings. Even though it looks like a smooth curve, what's important here is petition on the x-axis is done by only 28% of the population. But this non-institutional group has a 0.5-ish probability of engaging in this activity. Similarly, the other indicators that are circled are those for which this group is particularly high compared to the average of the population. Similarly, for the institutional group, the 7%, we see that they're particularly high on these 3 classic indicators of working for party, contact, and organization work. And on voting, we see their voting is high, not surprisingly. So this is, theoretically coherent groups. Those who've used latent class analysis also know that can be a challenge. You don't know quite what's going to come out if it's going to make theoretical sense, and we see that it really does here. And the activist group, they're relatively high on all measures. So for example, only 4% of the population, as we know, do anything related to parties. This group, that's their least active measure, and they're around 40%. Okay. So this puts them all together with a little bit of color. These are our 5 groups. And I'm just going to give you one slide on summarizing the regression results of the correlates. Yeah. Oh, okay, thanks. So what we see in these findings, and again, we're in the middle of updating it to the most recent year, we analyze the prevalence over time of these 5 different groups and their socioeconomic correlates. Of the groups, in terms of their over time change, the biggest change is of the inactive group, which increases in size the most from the 2002 to the most recent time period. We also see some increases in the non-institutionalized and in the activist groups. But the institutionalized group, those who are particularly active in party type behavior, but not active in other things, has decreased. The socioeconomic correlates don't surprise us from what we know from the literature. The education, the inactive is lowest in SES, followed by here the non-institutionalized, and then subjective income, the findings have the same pattern. So summary of these preliminary findings, we see, this is, as far as I know, the first cross-national implementation of LCA using this kind of theoretical and methodological approach, that there's a contribution here to be made in terms of using an actor-oriented theory and analysis. And we have this implementation of these methods that I noted at multi-level with covariates, measurement equivalents that we established across countries before running the analysis, and these semi-supervised specification of specific groups, for example, inactive. And the next step in the substantive research, and this ties us back to the ERC project, is first, broadening out the set of data that we're working with. ESS is a go-to because it has high quality and it has these really set indicators, but we know that there's a lot richer data out there that can be combined into a broader and more comprehensive data set. And connecting these participant types to patterns of representation. And another piece of the next step methodological research is that we've begun to focus on now is differential item functioning for specific political acts. So for example, protests, there's some theories, maybe that actually really functions very differently in different countries. And we need to do closer look at that particular indicator. And we've begun some work to implement that in software as well. So that's it for the preliminary findings. I'll wrap up with 2 slides on visions for next steps that I already started to mention here on the participation representation connection. So this brings us back, all of this technical, methodologically specific work to these big picture questions is really one of those black box questions in political science. Are politically active citizens better represented by representational outcomes? Until recently, the data, the methods have been sort of a bit fuzzy in terms of being able to reach robust answers. And here I noted the bottom example of some research that has paid attention to different kinds of representational outcomes. So the first one is a self-citation led by my colleague Ruth Dassenville, the EJPR paper, where the representational outcome that we were looking at there was social welfare spending. And so we're able to take a look at people's left-right preferences. And in that paper, we only looked at voting. So whether voters are better represented than those who don't vote. These other 2 papers here use other measures to measure representational outcomes. We have Lupo and Warner, who've done some really excellent work on congruence between citizens and their representation and their representatives using elite legislator survey data. And finally, the policy implementation data. This is from Person and Sundell, fresh off the press, and BJPS, where they have done an amazing job coding all different kinds of implementation of policies that can be matched to citizen indicators. So there's a framework here for being able to move forward in getting some answers to these important questions. I think I'll pause there. I have more slides I could add in, but I'm looking forward to the questions and discussion. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer. So if the floor is open to questions, comments, remarks, it can be in the room or online. I think that Simon was first and then Philip. Okay.
Thank you, Jennifer. Fascinating project. I just wondered if you had have you investigated some of the heterogeneity in the patterns so heterogeneity by age, gender, cohort, and how that has changed over time? I mean, the ESS is very rich for investigating. I'm sure you've done it, and I just wonder what patterns you're discovering there. I mean, is it that younger people are voting less and demonstrating more? Like that's a kind of stereotype we have, but is that really there in the data?
Yeah, really important question. And questions like that, the compilation of this harmonized data set is going to allow being able to do a broader test and also comparative test of those kinds of questions. And until now, when you have the ESS, you have just a certain set of countries. And so, yeah, we've done that in a preliminary way with these data, and they show us what we would expect, just as you noted, the voting is, older cohorts or older people are doing it. The protest is more by younger people. We haven't yet focused, I see that as sort of, we've laid that out in the ERC work plan as a year 2 series of papers. Partly with an approach of, with the harmonized data set, our aim is to do a working paper from each of the different data sets. So we've begun with ESS and get very specific on precisely those kinds of more fine-grained questions with an aim of then taking those separate working papers on the separate survey data programs as the basis for assessing, all right, what can we know more broadly across the groups?
Two remarks to a very rich and interesting presentation. The first one is that when you were at the very beginning, you set up this dichotomy essentially between voting and demonstrating. And of course, there's a huge area in between those, which most people would call participation in civil society, which at some point, I was very happy to see later on that you did pick that up, because there's quite a literature now on the decline, particularly of trade unions, but also professional associations, even business associations in terms of, so there is a question about participation in this other intermediate form, so to speak. And I see you got it in there. I'm just curious to know, are you looking at that in any particular way, or because in your initial presentation, it looked like you were looking at these two ends, so to speak, and all of this other kind of. And the second is more theoretical and is very much associated with this very place and a both graduate of and professor of Peter Mayer. And this has to do with the nature of representation itself. You seem to be assuming that representation, to be effective, there must be evidence of what Peter would have called responsiveness. That is, this is what they ask for, what do they get? He points out that representation is a more complicated process, and he has this bifurcation or this somewhat dialectical relationship between responsiveness and responsibility. And of course, in the case of Europe in particular, I don't think, no, I guess all of the member companies are involved are members of the European Union. And therefore, to a certain extent, the policy is responsible to directives and, regulations that are being emitted, not from their own government, but from another government, but for presumably other or broader purposes. So I just wanted to know what sort of theory of representation you're applying. It would appear to be exclusively this idea that you should look for responsiveness. Yeah. But I also see that this, whereas I don't know, your civil society category there, it, not unexpectedly is going down, right? And so, and perhaps even more than some of the other forms. The voting category seems to be staying relatively, I mean, it has a certain cyclical property, but it's relatively high and consistent. Whereas the civil society, particularly if you look at those kinds of organizations that represent precisely the groups you're trying to pay attention to, that is to say, lower status working class and even pre or non-working class, unemployed, whatever. So what's the theory of representation that you're using? Or I didn't see this. Okay. So that your stage 2 is citizens non-electoral nonelectoral participation, is that what I'm calling civil society? Is that sort of, no? Ah. Oh,
Yeah, no problem. And for those of you who don't know, I just met him myself. This is Philip Schmitter, who I first met several years ago. I see there are several of you here on Zoom from Israel who came and was an honored guest with us in Jerusalem a couple of years ago by David Levy-Fauer for a graduate student conference. So it's an honor to have you here. And I'm glad that you asked this question of civil society, trade unions. So that was the first question. I'll address that first. Also, because it connects back to my earlier work. My first work as a researcher was with Theda Scotchpole on a civic engagement project where we tracked over time the decline of civic engagement groups in the US. And that doing that historical work was really part of what led me leading up to doing MA work in Israel to ask that question of, all right, we know these civic groups are declining, but it seems that people are politically active, right? We have work by Dalton, we have other kinds of work that people are participating in different ways. Right. Yeah.
You don't have a way of distinguishing.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'll say in this project, this is, an ERC project seems huge, but it's 5 years. In this first 5 years starting project, so I chose not to include also taking a look at organizations and institutions, even though that's a big part of the work that I have done in the past and that I think is key to next steps from this finding. What I have here, you always want someone to ask the question about the slide. We didn't have time to include. So this is a theoretical model that addresses your question of what is the model here of representation. So the stages in black across the stop, stage 1, 2, 3, 4. Many of you will recognize this from the work of Chibi Powell, of Bing Powell. His 2004 essay and in other works has laid out this very clear model of citizens' preferences lead to voting behavior, lead to selecting policymakers, lead to public policy outcomes. And so the model that I'm using in this project is taking a look also at stage 2A that I've called here in the model of citizens' non-electoral participation, still tied into paying attention to what's happening with standard types of responsiveness that can be measured. I also see what you're describing. Peter Mayer and other researchers recently, Jenny Mansbridge and others have worked on more complicated and nuanced types of representation. If we finish up all these work packages or sooner than planned, I think that having the objective representation measures will then be a strong framework for then taking a look at reciprocal representation, other aspects of that that can be done more robustly with panel data, which is also part of what we're working on in the broader project. Did I get both of your questions? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. I also have two questions. They relate to the 2x2 table that you produced, because you have four categories, obviously a 2x2 table, but then in the latent class analysis you find 5, and you have the institutional one on top of the vote specialist, and I didn't really understand why they're separate. Because the 2x2, I mean, you would have the institutional specialist that would include or subsume the voting. Yeah. Yes, and you have the slide with the percentages, and no, I don't.
The European.
This is only the US countries.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Okay. Yes. Thanks. So I was wondering about that, and then because actually that would then be very convenient for the 2x2 table if then you have 4 and then I have a second question that relates because to the 2x2 table, so you have the institutional and the non-institutional, and both are forms of participation. I don't see much representation there, but that's the next another step in the. But I thought one, because you mentioned the two hypotheses at the beginning, then I thought maybe we can put them together. Because I was wondering what kind of class of citizens is it that decides to protest but not vote? There must be something going on in their minds. They say, okay, I don't trust politicians, I don't trust the system. It's an anti-system, anti-politics kind of class, but still one that participates. Whereas the institutional ones, they probably think, okay, everything has to go through the formal institutional channels. Protest leads to nothing, and so on and so forth. And there you would have a conceptualization of representation, not only participation. So I would imagine that those who protest but do not vote, that would typically be a grievance kind of representation, maybe. And the other way around. I mean, voting has little grievance on it. It's communicating, right? It's but it's a question.
Jump in on this.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, I think about my kids, right? Lobbying them to vote is a pain in the neck, but they're perfectly happy to go out on demonstrations, right? So, and that's not grievance. That's sort of symbolic politics, feeling good about themselves, feeling they're influencing the world, feeling they're expressing their opinions. But getting them to vote is a pain. Oh, why do I have to do this? It's a pain, and I have to register, and I have to spend my time doing this, and it doesn't change anything anyway. So that's not grievance-based. That's more a style of politics, right? That's not, you know, and equally there's other people you can argue who go and vote to express a grievance, go and vote a protest vote against somebody, but would never go out and demonstrate.
Then I need more explanation of what you mean by grievance. Because if it's an identity thing, it's a symbolic expression, then maybe it means something I'm not sure of, but I think there is a further point.
Let's let Jennifer respond.
Okay, great. Good. I was hoping for a lively EUI discussion. I see some colleagues here on Zoom who I've discussed before. The first person to speak here was Danielle Karamani, who I met here on this visit for the first time, who was a masterful co-authored AJPS article with my colleague Ari Bertsu using LCA. They're looking at a different theoretical focus of technocratic experts, but in the same kind of realm of empirical work. So relating to this question of here there are 5, in the 2x2 there are 4, there's something for those of us who know voting, and I think Simon will agree with me, there's something unsatisfying about not having the people who vote only and do nothing else be mixed in with the non-institutional group probabilistically. And then it looks as if they're participating in other ways, but we know empirically, actually, they vote and they don't do anything else. So I've always kind of wanted to implement that. That's something that in past papers before working with my co-authors on this paper, I've done, you know, a manual coding of 0-1, kept them as people who only vote and then added them back in later, which obviously isn't ideal in terms of the statistical modeling for this kind of a model. So that in terms of the groups, it could be that I need to adjust the theoretical figure at the beginning to reflect that. The other point that you made about grievance, and I'll relate here to Simon jumping in and talking about his kids, who presumably they were either in England or in Italy at the time, in England, right? So the fact that Simon sort of chimes in a really great way with this real experience of actually protesting isn't a hassle. It can be fun. It's a life. It's a positive expression. It's a party, right? There's all these other aspects to it. So maybe it's that way in England, and is it that way also in the Czech Republic, or is it that way also in Romania, or these other countries that we pool all the data together and we have theories about how it works across these countries. And so that's precisely, that's one of the theories about why there might be a group that is lower on voting, but then still robustly active in other ways. It could be a lifestyle thing, or it could be a sign of frustration and lack of trust of the government. If you really believe that your vote is not doing anything. So perhaps that's the classic grievance model, that you don't believe in the electoral system, that either voting or contacting your politician isn't going to do anything because it's corrupt or ineffective. And so you're out in the street protesting really just for a frustration valve sake, without an expectation necessarily that there's going to be political change, certainly not in the short term, right? So that's the kind of classic grievance model. Did you have another question there, Danielle, that I missed? Okay, great.
Yeah, it kind of just relates to this discussion that was going on. And yeah, during this talk, which I found really interesting, by the way, it's a super cool project. But I was just thinking, like, what's the difference between voting, which is an act you do every 4 years, and there's lots of considerations that go into it, and you're voting for a party that has lots of different platforms, policies, whatever, and then participation. And participation is generally around probably one policy area, right? Like, I'm thinking about like climate change, for instance. That's what I kind of think about a lot and work on. And, I'm not that far away in age from Simon's kids. And I know lots of people who have no problem signing a petition about climate change and sharing it on their social media. And it's a bit of virtue signaling. And this is my politics. I'm progressive, look at me, I'm the same as everyone. But then voting, they say, well, I'm busy that day, or blah, blah, blah. And so I wonder, like, in the ESS data, I know they ask questions around, what's the most important issue to you? And maybe if there's a way to bring certain kind of keyhole or like really highly salient issues into the analysis and break it down in that way, in some way, it might kind of tease out a bit more of what's underlying all of this.
I didn't catch your name? Max, thanks. It's a great question, and that's precisely part of what we are intending the contribution of. I guess the screen is getting a little tired. There we go. Oh, I just have to read the math. Once we have this, compiled participation harmonized data set, so there's several different kinds of representational outcomes that can be measured along different types of policies. And in the different data sets, we do have data on individuals' policy preferences. So for example, in the ESS, there's data on environment, there's data on migration, immigration. Obviously, observational survey data is not the best and the only by far source to be able to measure these types of topics, but it's a useful infrastructure of observational findings to take a look at over time and across country, that then in this project is aimed to anchor the qualitative field work and then also the experimental work in work package 3 that wasn't the focus of this talk, but is for me the part that I'm most excited about, using the observational data as sort of like an infrastructure framework to be able to get to those questions of causal mechanisms for being able to mobilize and also work with groups who are aiming to have representational impact. Okay.
Thank you very much. I think there are some questions online.
Oh, sure.
And
Did you want?
yeah, sure.
All right.
So Ibrahim, do you want to ask a question? And there is then Calypso. Okay.
Right. Yes. Thank you very much for like this excellent presentation and
Nice
for
to
sharing
meet
the. Yeah, nice to meet you too. Yeah, again, like thank you for like sharing these preliminary results of your really compelling research. So I guess I have a question regarding the broader research project. So since I have been engaged in this type of particular like research agenda, I'm wondering whether you have considered integrating more like polity level indicators, like such as political regime types, like autocratic versus democratic regimes, party regimes, military regimes, etc., into your analysis, like particularly when studying the global trends outside of European countries, like especially like in the light of like the current global tendencies toward democratic backsliding and the surge of populism. I believe like these factors could like substantially influence the evolving patterns that you showed us, like the increasing inactivity levels or like increasing non-institutional participation patterns. So I think these might be in place. So it's like this could be important even for the same country patterns over time, right? So I mean, it's feel like as a person coming from a country which has democratically backslided over time, I can totally relate with the results that you showed, and I believe like one of the main reasons we saw like more inactivity or like increasing vote shares or like turnout rates without like engaging in like activist type of political behavior was partly results from the democratically backsliding nature of the country. So could you please elaborate on whether these aspects will be incorporated into the research project, or is it like outside of the scope of it? Thank you.
Thanks, Ibrahim. Do you want to say it?
Yeah, so whether we collect two or one, like one
Uh,
at a time.
I'll answer that one briefly, and then
Yeah,
we'll see about collecting. The answer is yes. It's nice when you can have a brief answer. That is 100% an aim of I've been presenting a preliminary findings paper here that's focused on the individual level, and the aim, particularly of the harmonized data set, is to be able to take a look at robust trends contextually and factors contextually that might make a difference for these topics. For those who are interested in taking a look at a bit more of the specifics, so on my website, the ERC project page, there's a link to the project summary that's about 12 pages-ish. Those who know ERC speak, it's like a summary of the B1 that includes some of the hypotheses and expectations there. So thanks, Ibrahim. And maybe I see Marta, you have your...
I think that Calypso was nice.
Oh, Calypso, yeah, great. Calypso? Hi.
Yes, thank you very much, Jennifer, and sorry not to be in Florence right now to be able to discuss directly, especially.
You are, it's beautiful here.
Indeed, and especially since not long ago I was in Israel, where of course it's interesting that you mentioned Israel in general, but the contestation over the relationship between participation and representation is of course huge in Israel right now. And indeed the protests expressing the gaps. So I mean, maybe it would be interesting to connect, but no, I had just three questions. I mean, one is super hyper general, and it's simply that I heard you several times say, well, that's what we would expect. So I was wondering if any results so far, and I understand you're in your first phase, you know, really surprised you, were different from what you expect. The second thing was, I mean, pure clarification. So in the box, if we, a bit following Danielle, if we put the 5 categories in the 2x2, so there's 2 in the yes, no, yes, so vote only and institutional are in the same box of the 2x2, if I understand correctly, because you didn't show that. Yeah, the vote only gray and the institutional blue are both in that same box of institutional, but not non-institutional, I imagine. And then, but then what does the institutional do in addition to vote? So that wasn't entirely clear to me. And also, I mean, I have a very small semantic. I don't know why the yes is called activists, because if I'm right, but you know, all round activist, okay, but activist is a bit strange in terms of labeling. So that's just clarification. But now on the substance, on citizens' non-electoral participation, And just to follow up a bit on Simon Hicks, so, you know, protest, not voting is not just grievances. Indeed, another aspect of that is, you know, a big study we did at STG on informal civil society with 6 or 7 countries, very systematic, showing the why and the how of informal involvement, informal activism, fluid, horizontal, but also citizens who take in their hand the provision of public goods, local public goods, like taking care of refugees or creating small green energy communities or whatever. And these are forms, I would say, of participation in the public sphere, but they're not linked to grievances. On the contrary, they're linked to an idea of the world of tomorrow that people would want to live in, and kind of, just by demonstration, expression, participation by demonstrating what, you know, public goods can be. And that leads me to the second question. So participation.
I see, Calypso, I see there are other people who have their hands up. So if you could say them briefly, and then I'll answer. Yeah, you have a second question.
The second question is theories of representation, feel represented. So, you know, how endogenous is it? Because in your graph, you have the representation, standard, output, feel represented. But of course, if you participate, you feel more represented, whatever the outcome, all outcome being constant. But also there, you know, following on Philip, there are other theories of representation, descriptive representation. A lot of what we do at STG has to do with citizens' assembly, random selection, citizens' jury, participatory budgeting. All of these are modes of participation that increase the sense of being represented, but descriptively or randomly. And we have a big project on this, which I hope I can discuss with you off screen.
That would be a pleasure. Yeah, thank you. Let me go ahead and gather the next question so that I know our time is short, so that we can, I wrote the questions down and I have answers for you. I'll get to them after taking the next question. Marta?
Yes, hello. Thank you for the presentation of this really exciting project.
Pleasure. I think until now we've only interacted on Twitter, so it's nice to see you.
Yes. Maybe that might change. Hopefully, maybe.
Hopefully.
I have a question about your harmonization plans, because I've been involved in harmonizing cross-national survey data for some time, and my general takeaway is that while with attitudinal questions, things can be done to harmonize measurement, with questions about participation, a lot of the time, more problems are created than are being solved by pulling the data. So I'm really curious what your planned approach to this is, and how you're thinking about this.
Yeah, great. Good. I'll take the second question here first and then come back around to Calypso's question. So first, the harmonization of the participation indicators. Thankfully, there's a group of colleagues who I think you know them and been in touch with them somewhat, who from the Polish Academy of Natural Sciences, who, I may not have said that fully correctly, but who have done a harmonization project. They call the Survey Data Recycling Project with NSF funding, where they've completed recently harmonizing all of the separate participation variables. And in some cases, and this is what'll be tricky for the harmonized data set, there are different versions of those variables. So for example, we know with protest, one of the challenges with how it's been measured in surveys over time is sometimes, for example, in Barnes and Cass's a classic study, people are asked, have you ever protested? So you have people who are, 60 years old, people who lived through the 60s, who are giving a yes, no answer to ever protest. Whereas the ESS type indicators, people have been asked, just in the past 12 months. So essentially, those are kind of two different indicators. And so for some types of participation measures, there are sort of two different versions of indicators that have already been harmonized. But if you take a look at in the Harvard Dataverse, they have all of those separate kind of harmonized variables. They haven't put it together into a single harmonized data set. Their aim, which is amazing, was to take 22 all the surveys possible and then do the broadest possible harmonization each separate variable with no other covariates or no other analysis yet, right? But we're often really curious about the broader data set, right? So this project will be, building on that. The PIs of that are on the expert network of this project, and I'll be, working on that in coordination. But several people have recommended that I advise with you, so I also look forward to discussing with you the harmonization approaches. So thanks for that. I'll come briefly to Calypso's question. I think there might be another question in the room. So first, thanks, Calypso, for these first 3 points about hyper general at the beginning, that has anything surprised me in the findings? And so this actually was a point I wanted to raise earlier in relation to the dialogue between Danielle and Simon. One finding that I've seen consistently in this work, and up until this paper, the LCA kind of findings that I've done have always been in a single country, right? Because these software innovations of being able to do cross-national work are in place only recently. But a finding that is sort of not well known in the field is that this non-institutional group, this is the group that is, we know that it's high on petition, it's high on boycott, et cetera. It's relatively low on voting probabilistically compared to the other groups, right? But it's still at the mean of the ESS, right? So this idea that there's a group of people that is massive and big and concerning for democratic legitimacy, that is out there protesting in the streets, they're doing all kinds of non-electoral things, and they're not voting, that group of people doesn't show up robustly in the latent class analysis work that I've done so far. I say that with a caveat because, I've worked with I have 3 or 4 LCA papers using US data, and this is using ESS data. We might expect of that group of people who are really disengaged from voting, not only because they're Simon's kids and they just don't really feel like registering, but because they don't believe in the electoral system in Eastern Europe, that group might show up when we have a broad enough data set and we're able to look at it more carefully. So that's to answer Calypso's question. Has anything surprised, is anything against the expectations in the literature? And I think that's a solid finding that we'll end up sort of building on over time. Thanks for the comment about the 2x2 specification. Yeah, there's some work to do there. And yes, the all-around activists. Yeah, I think in the paper we might have called it all-around activists. I think I just simplified it for the figure, but thanks for that. And then Calypso had 2 questions, the STG about formal civil society, refugees, et cetera. That there's another kind of participation that's not grievance-based, but other-based, and point well received. I think it's sort of beyond the scope of what I and we will aim to do in this project, but I think it's a really important perspective. And this question of whether feeling represented is endogenous. So certainly we expect that there's different kinds of research design challenges in being able to measure that well. The importance, however, of still trying to do it, I think relates back to the point that I was just making about are there countries, contexts in which grievance is driving the participation patterns? One of the only ways that we can know if it's grievance versus communication is also assessing indicators related to people's subjective sense, whether it is support for democracy, whether it is trust. There are different kinds of indicators that can be used. We'll need to do as careful a look at indigeneity as we can, given the survey limitations. I think, is there anyone else in the Zoom?
I think there was
at
least one in regards
to
questions.
Yeah, great.
Thank you, Jennifer, for presenting the project. As you know, I am your fan, so I was wondering, I saw at the very beginning that you also consider the people who basically don't vote as disengaged. Am I right? Okay, so just a clarification, in the inactive 14%, they are included over there? Yeah, they are included. So I was wondering that once the data are clearly harmonized, that would be a very interesting segment because, of course, as we know, I mean, people with the same socioeconomic characteristics and coming from similar backgrounds at a certain point decide to vote or abstain. And this is something that we are still investigating and we don't know why. So I was actually wondering if you are planning to focus on that. I mean, and how maybe if your focus will be, for example, well-being indicators or other kinds of indicators.
Thanks for that. Your methodological skills in this field really shine through in the question, and the short answer is yes. As I've done this LCA work, as I've said on limited data sets in different places, that group has always caught my attention because we know that the work of the classic political participation literature, especially out of the United States, Burbish, Lasman, Brady, and other colleagues, looks at associational findings, looks at regression findings where we're paying attention to who participates more and what are their characteristics. And yes, being able to very clearly identify those who don't participate. Again, here, I expect, and I would expect from the literature, there may be really interesting cross-national and contextual differences, right? So there's a whole line of literature out of colleagues from Sweden, Eric Amme and others, that talk about standby citizens. It talks about people who don't participate. We'd say in Hebrew or Arabic, they're sababa, they're okay. They're like, okay, this is a great country. Everything is going fine. I don't need to participate. I'm not going to register to vote. I may not even protest because the center of my life is elsewhere and this country is doing great. On the other hand, there may be other contexts in which people just being completely outside of the public sphere might have a different meaning. So that's a group that I'll be interested to learn more about. Oh, yes.
Jennifer, thanks. Could you put up the model with the two, the British, the American and the European, the model you had? I mean, I think a few people have alluded to elements of endogeneity in this model, but there's a couple of things I thought will be interesting to sort of tease out as you go forward. One is the role of parties and the feedback loop of parties here, particularly in the European context, because parties, opposition parties in particular, are often very involved in actually deliberately mobilizing and organizing. So it's not that there's a feedback between selection of policymakers and actually non-participation. But the other feedback I think is interesting, and increasingly people in recent papers are looking at, is feedback from the non-electoral participation through to vote choice. So, for example, the work on Black Lives Matter in the US and then how that shaped voting behavior in the subsequent US election, or work in Europe on how green environmental protests have influenced voting behavior in European elections and mobilization of green voters. So, I mean, it's not just a sort of, we're trying to influence policymakers. I think a lot of the collective action that's out there is trying to influence preferences of the public and then trying to influence how the public votes. Now, I remember when Greta Thunberg was asked, on American TV, if there's one thing young people should do today to address climate change, what should it be? And she said, vote green. And the Americans were kind of like, what? What are you doing? And she was like, it's the most important thing you can do. And so it was a bit of a shock to people. But I think that's the point, that part of the mobilization is trying to influence the electoral process as well as influence the policy process.
Thanks for that. My main quick response to that is I'd love to talk with you more about that, and especially the papers that you see as connected to that. Ruth Dassenville, who gave a wonderful talk yesterday on her book, we spent yesterday afternoon out in the grass in front of the library quite a bit, puzzling through precisely this model. We sort of had this written out and doing all the arrows and what are the, for example, party measures, Chapel Hill expert survey, for example, would that be stage 3, stage 4? What are the ways that it can be measured cross-sectionally? And further, what are ways that when the broader data set is compiled, so what are ways that the longitudinal work can be, the infrastructure of the data can then be leveraged to take a look at what we expect will be reciprocal effects that might play out in different party and electoral system contexts. So yeah, we're on the hunt for the literature to pull it together on that.
There is one question online.
Oh, yeah. Okay, great. Yes, Vesna.
Yes, thank you. First of all, thank you for the very informational presentation. I'm wondering if these data sets also include data on, for example, participating in European elections or participating on a more local level in local governance?
Yep. Great question. It's not in this current analysis, and it certainly is in some surveys. And so it's something that can be used in this kind of an analysis. It's unlikely to be, something that we would harmonize on across, a bunch of different data sets. But I think that's part of what's exciting about building the infrastructure of the project is then having sort of these rich working paper analyses that use the broadest number and types of indicators for each type of survey, and then narrow it down to what are the indicators that we can then retain when we're doing an analysis that's as broad as possible by country year. Okay.
Super. Yeah. I will also make a few comments and ask a question. Thank you for your fascinating presentation, Jennifer. A question that emerges, I think, is slightly related to the first question by Simon, the question of age, and in more generally, how durable and long-lasting these participant types are, and how much time does it take when until one jumps from one type to another. And I think this is something that could be really interesting to explore. And so I would suggest the use of panel data, if possible. And basically to look, if you try to look at the trajectories of participation. And because this would help us understand whether these categories that are identified by these analyses are something tangible, or whether this is just, a picture of the situation at a time, which is something that is extremely time limited. And, so there is the question of age, but there is also the question of period effects. To some of the earlier remarks actually referred to these, and there was this idea of cycles of participation, for instance, by Hirschman. And so this can be also reflected in your findings. So I think that that's something that should be elaborated on, and it raises a lot of important and interesting questions. My second question or remark would be whether it's possible actually to have a fair comparison when it comes to the quality of representation, when we compare those who participate in elections, who vote, and those who protest, because protesting is really like issue specific, typically activity. So if we compare those different groups on an issue, whether they are well represented on a certain issue, those who protest may be represented better. But otherwise, I mean, if ever those who protest are represented better on a large number of issues, or on left and right or whatever, then one would suspect that this better representation is not causal. It's not because they protest, it's because they do something else. And so the question is whether it's possible to have a fair comparison, actually. Thanks.
And for those who don't know, who are colleagues on Zoom, that question came from Philip Kostelka, whose World Politics paper with André Blais 2021 was as I was beginning to write the research design of the project, the paper came out and I was like, yes, this is the kind of work that should be done. So, for those who haven't seen it, they take a look at age generation specifically as perhaps one of and they establish it as one of the reasons why voting has declined in this really impressive and broad cross-national longitudinal data set. including panel data. And so, yes, I haven't mentioned it here. My mind is very much on the harmonized data set. It's a complicated step, and you can tell that that's where my my PI mind is focused at the moment. But with the use of these different panel data is front and center in the project as well. And I brought us back to the slide with my co-authors, Roberto Di Maria and Juja Beck, who are LCA statistical experts. Part of the aim there is to use latent growth models. Right? This has been traditionally, until recently, one of the other limitations of using this analytical approach to analyze participant types, is that it hasn't until recently easily accommodated doing what we would normally do as panel data analysis in a standard regression model. That's one of the methodological innovations that we're working on in this first year, 2 years. That'll certainly, they've already run with it. It's already in process. That'll certainly be useful for other projects as well. I'm just really excited to implement it precisely for this reason of the age question with these participant types.
The comparison question.
Comparison of voting and protest. Is it fair to compare them? Are we always fair as researchers? Yeah, I think it's a fair question. I think that this has been part of why, for me, the opportunity in an ERC grant to have multiple work packages where you can combine observational survey data with qualitative fieldwork and experimental work has been part of what has been so compelling about investing in working on the broader project. The observational data, it says what it says. We can't know if the reason why the respondent protested was X, Y, or Z policy issue, unless it was specifically asked in that particular year. And in that case, it's somewhat limited for the perspective of this project. So yeah, I think that a caveat will need to be very clearly made. Perhaps this is not a fair comparison, but these are the types of indicators. These are the ways that we know people are participating. And we're curious about the associational relationship between people's activity and whether those types of participators are represented, and then leave it to the other work packages to take a look at causal inference and other pieces like that. So, yeah.
You've just opened one of the reasons I came here. I'm very frustrated. And in order to explain my frustration, I would like to invoke a famous theorist of collective action who is not present, Mansour Olson. Now, if Mansour was here, he would say, all of this is ridiculous. It's totally irrational. There's not a single chance that any single individual doing whatever you measured them doing would make any difference in the outcome. So why in the hell do you bother at all? So, I mean, I think it's a useful point of departure, right? So it makes no sense if you are a sort of rational, you think in rational terms, so to speak. So I'm asking you the answer. That is to say, I'm hoping that this research will tell me why people do such irrational things when they act politically. Especially, of course, in these contexts where their own individual contribution is utterly meaningless.
Thank you. You're reminding me of the moment in my ERC interview when the person asked, so will this change the universe, this project? And I said, yes, of course. So that in 30 seconds had to say how. But I appreciate your invitation. I debated a little bit as I was preparing this talk. Philip warned me collegially very nicely. We just had the big ball Friday night. Everyone's on summer vacation. No one will be here. Thankfully, we have a wonderful crowd also on Zoom. But I thought, well, maybe I'll do something a little experimental. Trying to. Maybe I'll do something experimental and also trying to, deprogram from the ERC interview experience. So as we wrap up, I saved it as the slide, you know, that slide you saved behind the final slide that you're like, maybe I'll go there. So thank you, Philip, for the invitation. I'm going there now. And I'll say, I don't know if any of you have seen this article by Andrea Campbell. People know Andrea Campbell's work. She's done a lot on policy feedback. She's at MIT. Really interesting historical complex work. She also wrote a book. So up until the time that she wrote this book about her family story as political science, she had not done any ethnography. She was like a standard policy field feedback empirical political scientist. I don't know. Does anyone know? I don't know. She's an amazing scholar. She may be an amazing scholar in her own right. She wrote a book after having studied the safety net very carefully for a long time about her experience of her sister getting into a major car accident and becoming quadriplegic, and she had a whole new experience of the welfare net. And so she wrote, you know, a small piece here in Perspectives, a kind of personal reflection on her motivations of studying the topic. I haven't written anything about that yet, right? Like I haven't done the writing, but I'll say kind of experimentally on one foot in a way that I would like to develop in future writing, that my interest in this topic is deeply felt in the sense that we as comparativists are often people who have ourselves been transplanted from different places. My dad was in the Navy. Those of you who know Navy people in America, they call us Navy brats. Partly why do they do that? Because you move around from place to place. Until I was 12, I lived in Connecticut, which is the best education system in America. Then we moved to Charleston, South Carolina, which those who know America is about, you know, toward the bottom. And the lived experience that life can be different in different places is something that motivates me as a researcher, and then subsequently to Philip's question, as a community organizer. So when you look at my CV, you have to look carefully at the years. There's a 7-year gap between when I finished my BA at Harvard and worked for Theda Scotch-Poole and her research group. I really enjoyed doing it. I think I mentioned this to Danielle earlier today. Really enjoyed working there, and all of the academics seemed miserable. I was like, oh, this profession, this is not for me. So I worked as a community organizer in the US for several years, and then moved to Israel and worked as a community organizer in Israel several years. And the sense of, coming back to one of the questions that was on Zoom about Israeli politics, the sense of, as I'd say in Hebrew, yeush, the sense of sort of depression or that nothing can be done was a real surprise for me, moving from, you know, the American system in the early 2000s to the Intifada in Israel at that time. And so to bring it back around to groups, and that it's not all about, you know, individual rational choice, there are other lines of work that I have done and that I'm still doing now that relate to the broader question of political organizing, of mobilizing different groups. And part of my interest, it's not built into this project. However, this project in some ways is designed over time as a critique of the rational choice, in the sense that when I first saw, you know, and I'll wrap up with this, the article that interested me without having any empirical background and learning about how to measure participant types was an article by Russell Dalton, who is now on my expert network and a dear colleague. And the article made me very angry. The article is 2008 in Political Studies. And it said, you know, the political participation is expanding. Why should we worry that voting is decreasing? People are participating in other ways. So based on my 7 years of experience, some in the US, some in Israel, as a community organizer, my hypothesis without having analyzed data yet was, well, the people who are participating in these additional ways are likely individuals who are already voting. Why do we think that there's an expansion of the individuals who are politically active? So that was really, you know, the motivation, a similar kind of Manker-Olson kind of motivation of, well, let's measure this more precisely. Because when we can take a look at how individuals are participating in a broader way, then we can also loop back into groups in a broader way. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think that this is all. We have run out of time. So thank you again, Jennifer, for a great talk. Thanks everyone for a lively debate, and I hope to see you at the next events of the Transnational Democracy in the 21st Century cluster. Have a nice afternoon.